Iran's engineers spent 30 years building Kharg Island into something they believed was untouchable. Not just protected, untouchable. Buried fuel lines, reinforced export terminals, anti-ship batteries pointed in every direction, an air defense network layered so deeply that Iranian military planners told their own government the same thing, in writing, on record: no outside force can disable Kharg Island without a ground invasion. That document was written in 2019. On May 3rd, 2026, the U.S. Navy proved every single word of it wrong. Not with bombers, not with a ground assault, not with the weapons anyone in Tehran expected, with something Iran's engineers never modeled, never wargamed, never believed existed outside of classified American defense budgets. And here is what the headlines are completely missing. What happened to Kharg Island is not just a military strike. It is the permanent destruction of the last export mechanism keeping the Iranian regime economically alive. And the method used to do it has just rewritten every assumption every adversary of the United States holds about what is and is not possible at sea. Stay with American Echo. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because what just happened off Iran's coast is not the story of one operation. It is the story of the moment Iran's last lifeline was surgically removed, and the consequences are already cascading through oil markets, through Tehran's internal security apparatus, and through every naval calculation being made in Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang right now. To understand what was just destroyed, you first need to understand what Kharg Island actually is, because most coverage treats it as an oil terminal. It is not simply an oil terminal. Kharg Island is a 20-square-kilometer island sitting 25 kilometers off Iran's southwestern coast in the Persian Gulf. And for the Islamic Republic, it is not infrastructure. It is the circulatory system. Approximately 90% of Iran's entire crude oil export capacity flows through Kharg Island. Not 40%, not 60%, 90%. Every barrel Iran sells to China through shadow tankers. Every cargo that moves under falsified manifests through intermediary ports in Malaysia and the UAE. Every drop of revenue that funds the IRGC's proxy network from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq. It all moves through Kharg. Before this conflict began, Kharg Island was handling approximately 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day in export throughput. At $80 per barrel, that is $120 to $144 million flowing through that single island every single day. Iran's government salaries, Iran's missile procurement, Iran's subsidy payments that prevent domestic food riots, the payments to Hezbollah, the weapons flowing to the Houthis, the financing of every militia Iran has spent 4 decades building across the Middle East. All of it funded ultimately by oil moving through Kharg Island. This is why Iran fortified it the way it did. The island sits inside what Iranian military planners designated as a defense exclusion zone. Surface-to-air missile batteries, radar installations monitoring every approach vector, fast boat squadrons stationed at the adjacent naval facility at Bandar Imam Khomeini, ready to intercept any surface threat, coastal artillery, hardened underground fuel pipeline infrastructure running beneath the island itself so that surface strikes could not sever the flow. And critically, the export terminals themselves. Sea Island Terminal 1 and Sea Island Terminal 2, massive offshore loading platforms connected to the island by underwater pipelines, positioned far enough from shore that conventional naval gunfire from surface ships cannot reach them without entering waters saturated with Iranian defensive systems. Iranian engineers assessed the terminal architecture with a specific conclusion. Disabling Kharg's export capability would require either a sustained air campaign of a scale that would trigger full regional war, or a ground assault that no naval force could execute under fire. That was the calculation. That was the fortress. Then the U.S. Navy introduced a system Iran's engineers had never fully accounted for. Make sure you are subscribed to American Echo right now, because what I'm about to walk you through is the operational detail that every major outlet is glossing over. And it is the detail that changes everything about how this strike should be understood. The challenge with Kharg Island was never finding it. Satellites have photographed every centimeter of that island for decades. The challenge was the geometry. Kharg's offshore loading terminals sit in water too shallow for U.S. Navy submarines to approach within effective torpedo range. The island's air defense network, even degraded to the 15% capacity that remained after Operation Epic Fury, was still capable of engaging subsonic cruise missiles on predictable flight paths. Iran had specifically designed its radar coverage to detect and engage exactly the kind of attack vectors American planners would logically choose, and the underwater pipeline infrastructure connecting the island to its offshore terminals runs beneath the seabed, not on it, beneath it, protected by sediment, water pressure, and the simple physics of burial depth that made conventional explosive attack from any surface or aerial platform a low probability proposition. Iran's engineers were not wrong about the conventional threat assessment. Every conventional method of attacking Kharg had serious limitations. The U.S. Navy did not use a conventional method. What current operational reporting points to is the deployment of a system that combines three capabilities that have never previously been used together in a single combat operation. The first component, Mk-48 Advanced Capability Torpedoes, modified with an extended range guidance package. The Mk-48 AIDCAP is the U.S. Navy's primary submarine-launched heavyweight torpedo, but the variant deployed against Kharg's underwater pipeline infrastructure appears to incorporate the same GPS inertial navigation hybridization used in the GBU-72 bunker penetrator, meaning it does not simply run toward a heat or acoustic signature. It navigates. It follows a programmed trajectory to a specific coordinate. It arrives where it is aimed, regardless of whether the target is radiating any detectable signature at all. The second component, unmanned underwater vehicles. The U.S. Navy has been developing and deploying UUVs for over a decade. But the variants used in this operation appear to be the Orca-class extra-large UUV, a system with a 51-foot hull, a range exceeding 6,500 nautical miles, and a payload bay capable of carrying offensive munitions. These vehicles were pre-positioned in the weeks before the operation, moving through Gulf waters at depths and speeds that Iranian sonar arrays were not configured to detect. They mapped the precise routing of Kharg's underwater pipeline network using acoustic imaging, and then they waited. The third component is the one that makes this operation genuinely historic: coordinated electromagnetic pulse delivery, not a high-altitude nuclear EMP, a precisely targeted, low-altitude, non-nuclear directed energy discharge delivered by modified EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft operating at the edge of Iranian radar coverage, targeted specifically at Kharg Island's power distribution infrastructure, the terminals, the pumping stations, the control systems that manage flow through the underwater pipelines. You do not need to physically destroy a pipeline if you can destroy the control systems that operate it. You do not need to crack the seabed if you can make the pumping stations permanently inoperable. And you do not need to expose a single surface ship to Iranian defensive fire if submarines and pre-positioned UUVs can reach the infrastructure from directions and depths the defense network was never designed to cover. That is the combination Iran's engineers did not model, because each component individually was known. The integration of all three simultaneously against a single hardened target had never been done before. And Kharg Island's export infrastructure was not built to survive it. Let that capability framework settle for a moment, because now the operational sequence makes complete sense. The operation began not on May 3rd. It began approximately 19 days earlier. Orca-class UUVs were deployed from a U.S. Navy submarine. Assessment points to the USS Indiana, a Virginia-class fast attack submarine operating in the Persian Gulf, in mid-April. These vehicles conducted systematic acoustic mapping of the seabed around Kharg Island's offshore terminal infrastructure over a period of 2 weeks, identifying the precise routing of the underwater export pipelines, identifying the junction points where multiple pipeline segments connect, identifying the specific locations where a targeted strike would produce maximum and irreversible flow disruption, On the night of May the 2nd into May 3rd, three things happened within a 47-minute window. EA-18G Growlers, operating from the USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, delivered targeted electromagnetic disruption against Kharg Island's power and control infrastructure. Iranian radar operators on the island reported system anomalies. Backup generators activated. But the backup systems themselves had been pre-mapped and were included in the targeting package. Simultaneously, Mk-48 aid-cap torpedoes were fired from what U.S. Central Command has confirmed was a submarine operating in the Persian Gulf. The torpedoes navigated to pre-programmed coordinates at specific points along Kharg's underwater pipeline network. Not the pipelines themselves, the junction infrastructure, the points where multiple lines converge, where a single strike produces cascading failure across the entire network rather than a localized and repairable break. And the pre-positioned UUVs executed their terminal phase, moving to the base structures of Sea Island Terminal 1 and Sea Island Terminal 2 and delivering their payloads against the underwater support infrastructure of the loading platforms themselves. The entire sequence took 47 minutes. When dawn broke on May 3rd, Kharg Island's export terminals were no longer operational, not damaged, not degraded, not in need of repair teams and a few weeks of work, structurally compromised in ways that Iranian petroleum engineers are now publicly assessing will require between 18 months and 4 years to restore to even partial functionality. And here's the number that turns this from a military story into a civilizational crisis for the Iranian regime. Iran was already down to approximately 567,000 barrels per day of export capacity under the naval blockade. Kharg Island's remaining throughput represented the overwhelming majority of even that reduced figure. After May 3rd, that number did not drop by half. It did not drop by 75%. Shipping analytics firm Kepler, tracking Iranian crude loadings in real time via satellite, recorded a figure in the 48 hours following the operation that Iranian state media has not reported and will not report, effectively zero. Subscribe to American Echo right now and turn on notifications, because the internal picture I am about to walk you through is more significant than the military operation itself. Within 6 hours of the Kharg Island operation, three things happened inside Tehran that tell you everything about the regime's real assessment of its situation. First, Iran's oil ministry convened an emergency session, not a press conference, not a public statement, an internal emergency session at which, according to sourcing cited by Iran International, the minister told senior staff that the Kharg situation represented a, quote, fundamental change in Iran's export capacity timeline. Fundamental change, not temporary setback, not manageable disruption, fundamental change. Second, the Iranian rial, already under catastrophic pressure from the blockade, fell an additional 11% against the dollar in informal currency markets in Tehran within 24 hours of the operation. When a currency that has already lost half its value falls another 11% in a single day, that is not market volatility. That is a market pricing in the possibility that the regime producing that currency may not be functioning in its current form within a defined time horizon. Third, and this is the detail that deserves to be read twice, Iran's Supreme National Security Council reportedly convened its second emergency session in under 2 weeks. The first session, which we covered previously, concluded that protests were inevitable and that the regime could survive the blockade for 6 to 8 weeks. That assessment was made before Kharg Island. The second session's conclusions have not been fully reported. But the fact that it was called within hours of the Kharg operation tells you that the 6 to 8 week timeline has been revised downward. Here is why the numbers make that conclusion inescapable. Before the blockade, Iran was generating approximately $144 million per day in oil export revenue. Under the blockade, that had fallen to somewhere between $35 and $45 million per day. Painful, survivable in the short term if the regime made brutal choices about where to cut spending. After Kharg Island, the revenue figure is not $35 million per day. It is not $20 million per day. The regime's oil-based daily revenue is now, for the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic, functionally zero. The IRGC payroll is approximately $2.1 billion per month. The regime's subsidy commitments, the bread subsidies, the fuel subsidies, the payments that prevent the urban poor from taking to the streets, run to an additional $1.4 billion per month. These figures were already being funded through reserve drawdowns under the blockade. The reserves are not infinite. They were estimated at approximately $10 to $14 billion in accessible foreign exchange before the conflict began. 6 weeks of blockade, and now the complete elimination of export revenue has consumed a significant portion of that cushion. The Iranian regime is not approaching a financial crisis. It is inside one. And the walls of that crisis just moved significantly closer. The Kharg Island operation is not being watched only in Tehran. Every capital with a strategic stake in this conflict is running the same calculation right now. Beijing is watching with a particular kind of alarm that its public statements will not reflect. China receives approximately 1/3 of its petroleum through the Persian Gulf. Its shadow import network, the fleet of tankers that move Iranian crude under falsified manifests through intermediary ports, depended on Kharg Island's export infrastructure just as much as any official buyer. That network is now severed, not slowed, not complicated, severed. China's response has been to accelerate construction of the trans-Iranian pipeline bypass it began negotiating in 2024. But that pipeline is not operational. It will not be operational for months at minimum. In the interim, China faces a supply gap it cannot fill through any existing alternative at equivalent cost. Beijing's public neutrality on this conflict is a political position. Its energy mathematics are considerably less neutral. Moscow is watching the oil price with the same calculation it always applies. Every dollar added to Brent crude adds revenue to Russia's war budget. Kharg Island's destruction initially pushed Brent above $128 per barrel, the highest level since the early days of the conflict. But Russia is also watching something more strategically significant: the demonstration of what U.S. Navy capability can now accomplish against hardened underwater infrastructure has direct implications for Russian naval planning in the Baltic and the Black Sea. The same combination of UUVs, modified torpedoes, and electromagnetic targeting that dismantled Kharg Island can be applied to other hardened underwater infrastructure. Russia's defense planners understand exactly what that implication means for their own coastal installations, and Israel has been watching the Kharg operation with the same extraordinary attention it gave to the GBU-72 strikes on Iran's coastal missile sites. Because the combination of UUV prepositioning, navigating torpedoes, and targeted electromagnetic disruption represents a template that can be applied to other hardened underwater infrastructure in other locations that Israeli strategic planners have been studying for considerably longer than the duration of this conflict. The Kharg Island operation has not just destroyed Iran's oil export capability. It has served notice to every adversary of the United States that the definition of what is protected, what is hardened, and what is beyond reach has permanently changed. Here is where everything stands and what it actually means. Iran spent 3 decades building Kharg Island into something its own engineers certified was operationally indestructible without a ground invasion. They were right about every conventional threat vector they modeled. They did not model the integration of pre-positioned unmanned underwater vehicles, navigating heavyweight torpedoes, and coordinated electromagnetic targeting delivered simultaneously against the junction infrastructure of an underwater pipeline network. They did not model it because the combination had never been used before, because no Navy had ever demonstrated it was possible, because the assumption that it was impossible was, until May 3rd, 2026, a reasonable operational conclusion. It is no longer a reasonable conclusion about anything. Iran's last export lifeline is gone, not damaged, not degraded, structurally compromised for a period that Iranian petroleum engineers themselves are now measuring in years, not months. The regime that built its survival on oil revenues is now operating without oil revenues. The Security Council that said protests were inevitable before Kharg Island is now revising the timeline for what inevitable means. The 6 to 8 weeks they calculated as their survival window was based on Kharg Island continuing to function at reduced capacity. Kharg Island is no longer functioning, and the U.S. Navy is not repositioning away from the Gulf. It is still there. The USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group remains on station. The submarine that launched the operation has not returned to port. The Orca-class UUVs have demonstrated they can pre-position in contested waters without detection. Iran's engineers said it was impossible. The U.S. Navy just wrote the answer to that assessment in the only language that cannot be disputed. Results. Subscribe to American Echo right now so you never miss the analysis of what happens next in this conflict. The Kharg Island operation has permanently altered Iran's strategic calculus, and the regime's next move in the next 72 hours will tell us everything about whether Tehran chooses negotiation or faces something worse. Hit the notification bell. Share this with anyone who needs to understand what really happened at Kharg Island and why it changes everything. And tell me in the comments, do you think Iran can survive the next 30 days without oil revenue? Or is what we are watching the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic as we know it? We will see you in the next one.